Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Stephen Sparks, along with my wife. I'm the owner of Point Reyes Books in Point Reyes Station, California. We're about an hour northwest of San Francisco, and Berkeley, Oakland, kind of right on the coast along the National Seashore here. It's a true pleasure and honor to be hosting Terry Tempest Williams and Rebecca Solnit tonight in conjunction with Orion, who helped basically organize this event for us. We feel such a kinship with what Orion does that it feels like a natural fit for us. And we're honored and continue to plan collaborations and work with them. Along with Terry and Rebecca tonight, Chris Cox, who's the editor of the book that is sort of the ostensible reason that we're gathering here, although the conversation will be much broader, I think. But the most radical thing you can do touches on all these things that I think they're very much on our minds at the moment, very much on our minds at the moment. So thank everyone for taking the time out of a very sort of unsettling and anxious time as we kind of keep refreshing our browsers and checking Twitter and everything. Thank you. I feel such gratitude for everyone who has bought the book, everyone who has paid for a ticket. It means a lot for an independent bookstore, which we feel that it is a political kind of organ and a vessel in a community of its own. And so to be able to bring you something like this tonight feels great. I'm going to jump off right after I mentioned a couple of upcoming events that might be of interest to some of you joining us tonight. On November 16th, we will be joined by artist and illustrator Jackie Morris. You can see one of her swifts over here, over my shoulder here. Jackie is a collaborator, of course, with Robert McFarlane in The Lost Spells and The Lost Words, and I believe has work in the latest edition of the Orion Magazine. November 19th, we are hosting a panel discussion on the work and life of Charles Bowden, featuring Ariana Reigns, Alfredo Corchado, and Charles D'Ambrosio, potentially others joining us as well that night. And among the other events that we have lined up on December 3rd, contributing editor to Orion Magazine, poet essayist Amy Nezeke-Matatil will join us to have a conversation with the great essayist Elena Passarello about Amy's new book of essays, Worlds of Wonder. Also, Amy had an amazing poem, I believe it was hosted by the Poetry Foundation yesterday, called One Vote. If you have a chance, if you can find her video of her reading that, please do. It kind of helped me through some rough patches yesterday. With that, I'm going to bow out with a couple of quick technical things. As I was saying to the group here before, we're at the mercy of our Wi-Fi and broadband connections. If you're having a hard time hearing us, please check your volume. The event is recorded for later replay, so if anything comes up and you can't quite, if your internet slows down or whatever, please, you can watch almost immediately afterwards. The replay will be available here on Crowdcast, and we hope to also upload to YouTube as well. With that, the Ask a Question button is below here. Please feel free to ask questions. We're going to have some time toward the end of the conversation this evening to have some audience questions answered by Rebecca and Terry. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Chris, and I'm going to bow out from the screen, but I'll be monitoring everything, and please do ask any questions. And thank you again for joining us.
Oh, great. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to everyone out there for joining us tonight. Stephen said there's more than 1,000 of you out there. Maybe that number is ticking up now. It's nice to have a counter to watch that is just good news tonight, and it's great to share this moment with all of you in a very strange and unsettled time. As Stephen said, I was the editor of this collection of the best of Orion's political writing. And one thing that meant was that I had the privilege of going back and reading dozens of essays by Terry and Rebecca, who have been contributors to the magazine for a very long time, along with hundreds of others, in order to make our final selection. And that was truly one of the most fun assignments I've ever had while working at the magazine. One thing I learned from the reading and from essays stretching back more than 20 years into the past was how we can make change happen no matter who is president. The earliest essays, I think the very first one was written during the end of the Clinton administration, and it stretches through Bush and Obama and Trump. And I think if you take a look at the collection, which in addition to the essays by Rebecca and Terry, has contributions from Robin Wall Kimmerer, Glenis Redmond, Bill McKibben, Wendell Berry, Barbara Kingsolver, and Gretel Ehrlich, among several others. You'll find some useful and bracing advice for how to navigate the uncertain future we are all facing right now. And I'll just directly plug the book now. It's available from Point Reyes Books. I think there's a button that you can push even in this live stream to purchase the book. You can also go to the Orion website, orionmagazine.org. And if you do go there, you should also subscribe to the magazine. It'd be a good way to get a glimpse of what the next 20 years of environmentally engaged activism might look like. And then finally, I'd like to thank Rebecca and Terry so much for their work and for talking with us tonight. I know everyone here is familiar with their many books, which are also available from Point Reyes, if you want to go search those later. Definitely go and buy those after this live stream, but I also wanted to highlight two forthcoming projects from Terry. The first is A Burning Testament, a collaboration with the artist Mary Frank, which is being published by Egan's Press this month. And in December, Terry will have another book done in collaboration with the photographer Fazal Sheikh called The Moon is Behind Us, which will be published by Steidl. Rebecca has recently been working with Oil Change International to help facilitate the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. And yesterday, perhaps she'll tell us about this, but she was in Reno, Nevada, working as a poll watcher, helping to protect our election. So I'll get out of the way now and turn things over to Rebecca and Terry. Everyone, please join me in welcoming them, and thank you so much.
Terry. Thank you, Chris. Yeah.
It's so lovely to be with you, even virtually. And I'm just realizing you're that rare creature, somebody who comes after me in the alphabet. Who's going to read first?
Why don't you go? I will.
And yet I could revolutionize the alphabet. And okay. But I won't discuss it for a long time.
I just have to say, I love that we have been brought together at this moment. I think it got me through these last 24 hours, and I just appreciate our history. I think about when we named each other Salmon Sisters because we continued to swim upstream when we tried to find each other in New York on the climate march, our ties to Nevada, the test site, to our brothers, and to Paris of the Climate Accord. And I just want you to know what your work means to me and to all of us here tonight. So it's a privilege. I can't think of anywhere I would rather be or anyone that I would rather be sharing this evening with than you. So thank you.
And the same to you, Terry. And I was thinking today on this bizarre and horrendous day that might be the day of a Biden victory by the time it ends in California, but is also the day we've left the Paris Climate Treaty. I was with Terry, with you on the day that the treaty was signed. And the day before was actually a bit like today. Everybody was convinced that 197 nations couldn't come to an agreement and that it was going to fail. And I had people being cynical and explaining to me what was going to happen. And then they somehow managed to thrash out a document. And I had press credentials, went inside and got 2 copies of it. And Terry and I actually held it in our hands. And it was such a beautiful and exciting thing. And we spent the day and the evening together. And in my bedroom, there's still a scallop shell from our dinner in a little restaurant in the Bastille. And it was really a remarkable day, and more remarkable because I got to spend it with Terry, who deepens everything she touches. And I probably sharpen everything I touch, which is a very different thing to do. I'm going to read a little from my essay in the book, and then something I wrote today, and then pass the stick to Terry. And this was such a curious piece to come back to. I think it's from about 2008, but it feels so germane to how we live under COVID. And it's actually, the title is not my title, but the title of the book is the title of this piece, The Most Radical Thing You Can Do. Okay, I'll just shut up and read. Long ago, The poet and bioregionalist Gary Snyder said, "The most radical thing you can do is stay home," a phrase that has itself stayed with me for the many years since I first heard it. Some or all of its meaning was present then, in the bioregional 1970s, when going back to the land and consuming less was how the task was framed. The task has only become more urgent as climate change in particular underscores that we need to consume a lot less. It's curious in the chaos of conversations about what we ought to do to save the world, how seldom sheer modesty comes up, living smaller, staying closer, having less, especially for us in the ranks of the privileged. Not just having a fuel-efficient car, but maybe leaving it parked and taking the bus or a bicycle, or living a lot closer to work in the first place, which I wrote before it turned out everybody was going to work in their kitchen or their laundry room, or a lot of us who aren't doing the essential work you have to show up for. So a third of carbon dioxide emissions nationwide are from the restless movements of goods and people. We are going to have to stay home a lot more in the future. For us, that's about giving things up. But the situation looks quite different from the other side of all our divides. The indigenous Central Mexicans who are driven by poverty to migrate here have begun to insist that among the human rights that matter is the right to stay home. So reports David Bacon, who through photographs and words has become one of the great chroniclers of the plight of migrant labor in our time. Today, the right to travel to seek work is a matter of survival, he writes. But this June, and my apology, I can't say these Aztec words right, or Nahuatl words right, but this June in the heart of Oaxaca's Mixteca region, dozens of farmers left their fields and women weavers their looms to talk about another right, the right to stay home. In Spanish, Mixteco, and Triqui, people repeated one phrase over and over: the derecho de no migrar, the right to not migrate. Asserting this right challenges not just inequality and exploitation facing migrants, but the very reasons why people have to migrate to begin with. So, and of course, one thing we don't talk about, particularly when refugees and migrants are being demonized, is that a lot of them never wanted to leave home, and leaving home is wrenching and heartbreaking, but they do it because it's the only way to survive, to have a future. And more these refugees are climate refugees. So I'm the granddaughter of refugees who would have died in the genocide had they not left Eastern Europe. And that came up today. And when I wrote this other piece, I wrote something today I'm going to read too, because every time something shitty happens in this country, a bunch of already pretty comfortable white people say like, I can't take this. I'm moving to Europe. I'm moving to Canada. I'm moving to fill in the blank. And I just got pissed off and wrote a tirade. Okay, people who make noises at times like this about leaving the country and who are not directly targeted by laws and terrorism against you, not only does that flex the privilege of being able to do so or imagining that you can, which many do not share, but it imagines your residence in this country as being akin to being a hotel guest. You're complaining that you hate the room service and you're going to take your business elsewhere. Not only is Canada not the Motel 6 that left the light on for you, but we are not guests in the USA, especially those of us with the privilege that also means the power to protect others. We are the cleaning staff, and we are here to clean it up and make it safer for the next people who come along. Or to unionize or support the union. Speaking of hotel workers, who in many cases, oh my God, I have a landline and a telemarketer. I'm going to get rid of it. Sorry about that. It has no answering machine. It would have rung forever. Where was I? We are the cleaning staff. We're here to clean it up and make it safer for the next people who come along, or to unionize or support the union. Speaking of hotel workers, who in many cases are the strongest union members around, or to take over the hotel and make it a utopia where everyone is a guest and everyone is staff and in management to whatever degree and in whatever local extent is possible, but abandoning difficulty that is more difficult for others than you has a lot of names. You pick one. What happens in the USA affects the whole world, and from elsewhere in it, you are also in the shadow, but less able to impact it. So you're choosing to let things get worse if you leave, or going there instead of getting ready to face the work that was always going to continue no matter what. You're leaving the mess for others. You're choosing some not very deep idea of taking care of yourself and nothing more, because expatriates are often disengaged, disaffected people with little impact. This is our country and this is our work, and we were put here to do it. Those of us who are safe enough in this regime and who have the capacity to influence outcomes and protect the more vulnerable. There is meaning in hard work and hard times, as there is not always in disconnected leisure and insularity. So deepen your roots, stretch your branches, and plant yourself like a tree. Here we are, here we will be. I'm also thinking of this country's indigenous people, whose deep relationships to place are not portable, of people for whom uprooting is a tragedy, of people who are here because not long ago, in order to not be destroyed, they had to leave the places they loved, the places in which they were rooted, of how we are not portable parcels ourselves, but nodes on networks in times like this call for strengthening those networks. Sorry, I was a little cranky. Over to you, Terry.
Thank you so much for that. And as you and I were talking before this went live, I think one of, if we can say a gift of the pandemic, is that it has brought us all home and to our knees. I think it has, as we were saying, I can't go back to my former life. There is something deeply, deeply grounding about being home and being held to account. I'm going to read the piece that is in this beautiful anthology, and it is the last chapter from the Open Space of Democracy that ran in a 3-part series in Orion. And I just want to say, I think on behalf of all of us as writers in this country, how grateful we are to have Orion take our voices and deepen them and sharpen them. And I really want to acknowledge Jennifer San, who was the editor of this piece. And I'm mindful when I went back into this was written in 2004 under the Bush-Cheney regime. And I was struck in rereading it how little has changed. And I'm also mindful of my brother Steve, who was dying when this was written. And I remember calling Jen and saying, I can't do this. It's too hard. My mind isn't here. And she said, you have to do it, because this is that moment. And I think that I remember reading it to my brother Steve before he died, and it was a reminder that even in the midst of death, we're still talking about freedom. In our increasingly fundamentalist country, we have to remember what is fundamental: gravity, what draws us to a place and keeps us there. Like love, like kinship. When we commit to a particular place, a certain element of choice is removed. We are free to dig in and allow ourselves to be mentored by the life around us. We begin to see the world whole instead of fractured. Long-term strategies replace short-term gains. Routine opens the door to creativity. We express ourselves. We inform one another and become an educated public that responds. It is easy to believe that we, the people, have no say, that the powers in Washington will roll over our local on-the-ground concerns with their corporate energy ties. It is easy to believe that the American will is only focused on how to get rich, how to be entertained, how to distract itself from the hard choices we have before us as a nation. I refuse to believe this. The only space I see truly capable of being closed is not the land or our civil liberties, but our own hearts. The human heart is the first home of democracy. It is where we embrace our questions. Can we be equitable? Can we be generous? Can we listen with our whole beings, not just our minds, and offer our attention rather than our opinions? And do we have enough resolve in our hearts to act courageously, relentlessly, without giving up ever, trusting our fellow citizens to join with us in our determined pursuit of a living democracy? The heart is the house of empathy, whose door opens when we receive the pain of others. This is where bravery lives, where we find our mettle to give and receive, to love and be loved, to stand in the center of uncertainty with strength, not fear, understanding this is all there is. The heart is the path to wisdom because it dares to be vulnerable in the presence of power. Our power lies in our love of our homelands. Democracy depends on engagement, a first-hand accounting of what one sees, what one feels, and what one thinks, followed by the artful practice of expressing the truth of our times through our own talents, gifts, and vocations. Question, stand, speak, act. We have a history of bravery in this nation, and we must call it forward now. Our future is guaranteed only by the degree of our personal involvement and commitment to an inclusive justice.
Thank you so much, Terry. I always think of you and Barry Lopez as having, more than any other writers, influenced me in having what I think of as a prophetic or the oracular voice, speaking directly to people's deepest hopes and fears to the moment in these kind of often declarative statements, not just the sort of journalistic describing what happened or what somebody experienced, but kind of what could be, what should be, what needs to be, what it feels like, and what these emotions are and how we deal with them. And it's such a necessary and powerful tool. And it reminds me that the history of the essay, I think no one's written, is that they really come out of sermons in a good way. So it's a joy to hear this, but a little wrenching to remember another difficult time. I'm just going to move this up a little. Another difficult time in this time, which may be about to change on us. I think is going to change on us, but has been incredibly difficult for anyone who cares about the climate, the environment, the vulnerable, the refugee, the queer, the marginalized, the non-white, the future.
Rebecca, how do you write every day with the pieces that you offer in the name of community on Facebook? I am stunned. I mean, the piece you just read today, I read this morning, and Brooke and I discussed it coming home from Salt Lake City. I'm wondering how you do that.
They really feel like part of a conversation. And a lot of my essays that have traveled furthest have been very reactive. Something's happening in the world, often something I find offensive or wrong-headed or troublesome, and my response to it starts to take shape. So it's a sort of oyster pearl methodology. And there's other projects where I try and write in praise of things or, start something from scratch on my own. But there is often this way, being in the dialogue with what people are thinking and feeling, both positive and negative, can be really interesting. It can also be a way to fritter away my time and energy. I've really felt compelled these last 4 years to, in the words of Jesse Jackson in 1988, keep hope alive. And one of my secret hopes for a Biden victory is that I'll feel like I can lay the burden down and read more books and spend less time inside other people's heads. There's a kind of noisy, busy disruptiveness about it, partly because it's also very short term. And one of the things I love about being a writer, and one of the things that makes me hopeful, is looking at things over a 500-year or 50-year time span rather than kind of what happened today. And social media and the news keeps you so much in kind of the shallows of what just happened and how everyone feels about it, rather than what is the deep context, what are the long-term changes, what are the unchangeable resources.
I loved coming home today. We went up to experience and witness the election in Salt Lake City with my father and his partner Jan and my brother Hank, Brooke and I. And coming home, it's like Castleton Tower is still here, and the Colorado River is still running, and Wingate Sandstone is still, pulsing. I think it is important to have that long view, and that's really, when everyone has been telling us in these past few days, especially in the last 24 hours, stay calm. I just thought, I don't want to stay calm. I want to stay engaged, but I don't know. I know what they were saying, relax. We have will be a Biden victory. But, I told you, I wrote you this wild, raging email last night, and I'm glad that I accidentally sent it to myself and not you, after hearing Trump's, what can only be classified as a coup, and it wasn't even on the headlines, whether that was intentional or not. But I wondered how in Nevada that reached you.
I was already home at that point. I went to Nevada with my friend Conchita, who's a labor lawyer who was doing poll monitoring. As a lawyer, she had more capacity to intervene if a voter had trouble, if there was some conflict or question. So we were roving around 4 polling spaces, places all day yesterday from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. And then we jumped in her car and came home. But it was really great to be in Nevada, and it kept me from doing what I would have done otherwise, which is checking the news every 23 seconds to see if anything had changed and what the results were. But of course, I came home and stayed up after midnight and heard what Trump did. And what's so bizarre about life under Trump is that he would utterly love to be a Stalin, Mussolini, a strongman, but he doesn't have the attention span and discipline for it. So he basically committed a coup, but it was a clown coup because he didn't actually suspend the election. And because for 4 years, this country has been tested, and there are a lot of good people, state representatives, civil servants, etc. There's a wonderful tweet this week from, I think, the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania, where Trump said something about what was going to happen in that state. And the Secretary of State said, we're going to count all the ballots until it's done. And it was essentially a way of saying, like, I'm the boss here. You're not actually in charge, and you're not actually going to disrupt the process. Because Trump really has this sort of great Oz delusional sense that he rules by fiat, and he doesn't. And I remember when Stephen Miller said the president's will not be disobeyed or something. And it was ridiculous because it gets disobeyed all the time. So it's been really interesting seeing election officials around the country refuse to cooperate, essentially, and insist on the, is this the federalist system, on the semi-autonomy of the states, which at times is such a burden for elections. But when we have such a corrupt federal government, it has been such a good thing. And their attempt to stop the vote counts and things like that hasn't succeeded anywhere. And they'll challenge the votes and demand recounts, most likely, but it's unlikely to change anything. So it's, but it's interesting because I think one of the things you're very cued into, we don't talk about enough in this country, is the psychic toll of living under what Masha Gessen called the other day a kakocracy, that dictatorship, or ruled by the worst of the worst, with the sort of the word cockeyed there. And this, just the constantly being around something that's incoherent, that's offensive, that is genuinely evil and dangerous and threatening, but that's also just ridiculous and inane. And And I'm feeling that so much in the election response. And one thing I'm seeing is people of color being really angry because white people once again have waved at them the threat of having a white supremacist presidency, president who actively desires to harm all of them and disenfranchise and disempower and take away what they've won through so much struggle. And it should have been better than this. And I do feel that. It should have been a great blue wave. It should have been a huge repudiation of Trump. And the fact that 4 years of watching this show, so many people still voted for him. Isn't that surprising?
I
But
think
it's outrageous.
that was the thing that was so disheartening last night.
Yeah.
And my father is a lifelong Republican. He voted for Biden. My brother, I don't know who he voted for, but I know he believed that it would be a landslide for Trump. And he was very quiet last night. And, I think that was the thing that seized my heart was I thought, how is it that half of our country sustains a president who is racist, who has engendered cruelty, ripped children from their parents, created policies and practices of violence on people and land. That's what kept haunting me all night, and it's haunted me today. And this morning, and this is not outside of us. This is us. These are not enemies. These are family members. These are people we love and who surround us. This is my state. And I wrote my brother a letter, or a text this morning. And, he had to leave at 6 a.m. to dig a trench, lay pipe where natural gas will heat our homes. He's a working man and a laborer. And I said, Hank, what am I not seeing? What am I not getting? What am I missing? And we talked for about an hour. He called me after work. And I said, tell me about the Trump voters. We left it in the third person, and tell me who they are. And he said, there you go. It's they, it's me, it's us. And the minute you say us and them, you have separated us. And we had a really powerful conversation. And he said, Terry, what is your education for? And my brother is the smartest person I know, honestly, the most well-read in our family. And he did not go to college. And he said, tell me, what is your education for? And he said, the men I work with, it's all they can do to live paycheck to paycheck. They don't have time to sit and think about the subtleties of the world. They don't have time to debate this or that. They just want good work. They just want to be able to take care of their families. They just want to go home and relax. And he said, it's the arrogance. And I said, is it my arrogance? And he said, I know you're a loving person. I know you care about me. But he said, I hear your language. And, we had a really strong conversation. And then he said, I couldn't sleep last night, even though I had to get up. He said, I watched Trump. And it was horrific. And then, and all of a sudden, the things that separated us brought us back together. And we had a real conversation. And I think what I'm interested now, and I think why it's not about being calm for me, it's about being engaged. I think we just need to have these hard conversations. I think we need to have conversations, period. I called my friend Becky DeWay, who I met at a convenience store at 11 at night because we'd forgotten to eat when I was doing a story for Orion on the Gulf oil spill. And again, we talked for an hour. And I said, Becky, tell me how you are. She talked about her hurricane, the latest hurricane, Zeta. They've had 9 this year. This is the latest one. She sent me a picture of the eye of the hurricane. And she said, I think this is where we are now. The winds go from east to west, and then they go west to east. She talked about that just in that moment of the eye of the hurricane, that calm, she saw these flashes of light She said, for me, that was God. And then I said, tell me about the election. She said, Terry, you don't really want to talk about it, do you? And I said, I do. And she told me how she felt. She's under chemotherapy. She lost her health because of the oil spill. She doesn't believe in climate change. She believes in the oil industry. And I thought, I said, Becky, how do we connect the dots? And she said, how do you live with your hypocrisy? Because you want no fracking. You want to keep it in the ground. You don't want jobs for oil workers. But you drive, you fly, and I said, and how do you not make the connection between your own health and what happened with the oil spill? That there are, the shrimping businesses collapsed because of this. And then she said, can I send you a case of alligator jerky? And I said, and I can send you some sage. So again, how do we have these conversations that don't destroy us, but deepen us? And I love Donna Haraway when she talks about how important it is to stay with the trouble, how important it is to make kin, the worlding that we are in. And I think that's what I feel this next 4 years can be. I'm grateful that Biden, it looks as though he's going to win. But I don't know what's going to change with the Congress, the Senate, the courts. And I think there's rough days ahead. And if the heart is the first home of democracy, how do we keep it open? How do we initiate these conversations? And when the pandemic lifts, have difficult dinner parties with our own neighbors and stay home.
There's so much to respond to there. And one thing, the arrogance comment, the right has built loyalty by constantly suggesting that Democrats, liberals, the left, coastal elites, to use one of their phrases, look down on them. And we're always being told, I am totally, I'm a half Jewish coastal elite here in my Victorian in San Francisco, for sure. But we're always being told that somehow we need to somehow dismantle that. But it's the right, it's the right's ammunition. They're constantly telling their own that we despise them and building that sense up. It's incredibly valuable and useful to them. It keeps people in the flock, keeps people on their side from feeling they can cross over. And I admire and I'm grateful to the people who do cross over. One of the ridiculous things about living in the Bay Area is that, it's homogenous the way parts of Utah are. We don't meet a lot of right-wing people here, and there aren't that many opportunities to have the conversations you had yesterday and today. But at the same time, I do want to hold those people accountable. We know Donald Trump is harming other human beings. It's loud and clear, and there's no way not to know about them ripping babies out of their mother's arms, about, 230 plus thousand COVID deaths. And if you care about jobs and work and labor, the Democrats are so clearly so much better. There is a way the Republican Party and the far right have become variations on a cult. And of course, part of what that cult is racism. There was a wonderful essay. I need to spend a lot of time on Google trying to figure out who wrote it, saying most of the things wrong with this country are due to racism. We don't have universal health care because there's too many white people who don't want people of color, who would rather die of lack of health care themselves than give immigrants and people of color something. That, we don't have good labor laws. We have violence. We have the prison system that also impacts whites as well as people of color in this most incarcerated country in the world. We have a lot of corruption of our democracy. We have a Republican Party that many years ago decided to become the party of white grievance, which in an increasingly non-white country, we're only 60% non-Hispanic white in this country now. In an increasingly non-white country means the only way you can win is through voter suppression. And they've now passionately committed themselves to voter suppression, which denies the humanity and rights of, the other 40%. And so I think we can understand them as human beings, and I don't think hate is in any way useful. but we do have to recognize how destructive this is and hold the people who have the resources and skills to see that accountable. And if you choose to vote for someone who's going to kill, that person over there, then you've kind of chosen to vote for that person's death, and you need to own it. And we get that version about abortion, but at some point also I feel like you just have to take the stance that I'm going to support these positions as right and honest and true, and I'm not going to get all morally relative.
I wonder, I was thinking today about what was the crossover between Hank living in Salt Lake City, Utah, laying pipe, and Becky, who is a Cajun woman, who was a county assessor and so smart, and ran a shrimping business in a convenience store, and also worked in the oil industry. And two things, and I'm being honest, and this is a hard thing to say, three things came up. One, Biden was okay, Kamala Harris was not, and that how fearful they were of her, which I thought was so interesting as a woman of color. The second thing was a fear of change, that they didn't know what other options they had. And three, that they did feel, they both brought up the notion of an education. And I thought that was instructive. And then I thought, I'm always thinking, how can I be persuasive? How can I be inclusive? How can I alter someone's mind, thinking, change their opinions? And then I had to think, when was the last time my opinion changed? And how was it that occurred? And so I'm interested in that question. And also, I think the importance of reflective activism, that it can't just be projected out, but has to be seen. I was interested in John Meacham when he said, we have to look at this. This split country is a collective expression of who we are. It isn't that that's who they are and that's who we are, but this is who we are. And to really deal with that reckoning of erosion and evolution, of who is this country? Do we dare to own our white supremacy? Do we dare to own our arrogance? I don't know. I mean, this has been a hard day. And in a way, the Biden-Trump election was secondary in my mind, even though I know how important it is to where we find ourselves as citizens.
I think that's part of the shock of the election, even though a Biden victory seems likely, is to be reminded so intensely and directly and quantifiably that we've seen 4 years of who Trump is, somebody who's, the sheer number and scale of his lies is staggering, that, the destructiveness, the dishonesty, all the ways he's damaged his country, and that he's still getting 65 million people voting for him, often voting directly against their self-interest around, health, the health of the environment, the health of each of us under COVID, the health of local economies, schools, etc., and stuff. In a way, I see, and I called them a cult earlier, I feel like white evangelical churches, which are very different than the Black evangelical church, Fox, the NRA, etc., have worked really hard to shape the minds of a large percentage of our population. The Koch brothers with climate denialism, the fact that that in most of the rest of the world, there is no big anti-abortion voting contingent. It's a settled issue that women have this right. It is in Poland right now, but in most, except for extreme right-wing countries, El Salvador and Poland, etc., it's settled that women have abortion rights. In most countries, there is no debate about the reality of climate change and climate. There are people who don't want to do what it takes to respond to it. but the kind of James Inhofe, who won election again, outright climate denial doesn't exist. And so all these forces, which are largely commercial forces looking at the bottom line, largely corporate, have manufactured consciousness in a way. And there are people, I absolutely believe you can see them as a lot of people as captives of it if you live inside that set of frameworks. But
what about the left?
blaming them isn't useful, but dismantling them is. What? I can't hear you, Terry.
But what about the left? Can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So what about the left, where I feel like we eat each other, where there's a purity mode? I can tell you my students are afraid to speak. And when they do, it's often performative. It's that, you just have to keep just whittling it down until you feel like you're getting their own mind, not the mind that they are taught to say, or the proper language for the fear. And now I sound like a right-winger, but the fear of being canceled. I mean, the first 4 weeks of my class in writing at the Divinity School is largely spent on coming at things sideways so that an original expression comes to the fore, because they're so scared that they're going to say the wrong thing.
My students, you were at Harvard, my students at Stanford were actually really open and kind and generous with each other. And I didn't run into stuff like that, but I know what you mean. And I could spend a lot longer than we have here talking about problems of the left. But I also think there's many lefts. There's a civil rights left that comes out of the Black church that's deeply generous and I think kindness driven. There's a kind of white dude left, old left, that is the opposite, that is punitive and intolerant and exclusionary. I think there's a lot of pragmatic people, many of them people of color, who know you need to be inclusive, you need to not terrify people to win, etc. I think some of what you're talking about is also academia, which has given us a lot of useful tools. I also feel like some of what we're encountering is we have a lot of new ideas about race and gender and identity and intersectionality. And I see a lot of young people trying them on. And I feel like in a way they're rough tools and we're going to smooth their edges in some ways. And also that it's a kind of overreaction to the lack of these things before, and that that some of this will settle down as new ways of thinking. But right now it can be very punitive. I had a very funny experience at Dartmouth some years ago where it felt like, yeah, if you didn't have this week's gender terminology, you were the enemy. And of course, you only had this week's if you were in graduate seminars in elite universities. So, everybody was the enemy. And it's interesting how much that comes out of fear, is that I need to arm myself and enter into combat, because that's what interaction is. And a lot of it, I think, particularly teaching, is how do you create spaces in which people feel safe to be their authentic selves and, kind of lay down their sword and shield.
And how do we as writers create an atmosphere where language can bind people together rather than pull us apart? And you and I both are devoted to story. And I love how in your memoir you say, who I was meant to be was a breaker of some stories and a maker of others. And I think the excitement of this moment is that in this reckoning, it is also an awakening, and the stories that are emerging, and how can we meet one another as human beings, not as beings of position or party or opinion, but to really listen to one another.
It is
how do we create moments for that?
And I think it is one of the great challenges for anyone who writes about culture and politics in the moment. How do you talk about them in a way that doesn't automatically fall into the categories and the lines that have already been drawn and the wars that are already being fought. How do you we use disarming as a description of what language or personal interaction can be. She was so disarming with her warmth and kindness. And it's like, how do you write disarmingly so people don't bring their weapons with them? Actually, that was one of the really nice things in Nevada. It's an open carry state. And we were kind of terrified that we were going to have guys with AK-47s in line at the polls and walking around. There was supposed to be a big militia demonstration at the main library in Reno, and none of that really materialized, and I was so relieved. But it's interesting that we're so far from disarming that we have this problem with people with literal arms showing up, and a very specific subsector of the population, angry white men, in ways that are terrifying to the rest of us. How do you function normally when there's a guy in Walmart with an AK-47, which can kill, as we saw in the Las Vegas massacre? Okay, I'm getting my weapons wrong. I'm a San Franciscan, but weapons that can kill dozens and dozens of people in a brief amount of time. What does disarmament look like? Could bring us back to our anti-nuclear and anti-war stuff and bring it forward into these conversations we have. Because I feel like defeating Trump is our short-term job. Bridging those divides, which I think we do by making our side so delightful and friendly and encouraging and inviting, that my mom used to say, you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. How do we make a culture that has room for everyone and that everyone wants to belong to? And there's anger across the spectrum that's often punitive to others, and and it's unequal. People, white supremacy is very different than black rage. But in the long term, how do we all live together in this country that will have a non-white majority in 24 years?
Hi.
Yeah.
It felt like that was a good point, maybe to answer a couple of questions. Rebecca, you just mentioned sort of like how the left can be friendly and engaging, and someone in the audience asked, what do you believe? This is from Katie. What do you believe is the most important action individuals can be taking now? What do you think are the most important actions moving forward, regardless of outcome? And I sort of wonder from both of you if, that's obviously something that's, as you said, the short-term work is hopefully happening right now, and long-term, how do we reassess and move forward?
And there's so many layers to that, and it's different. But let me Terry, you go first.
I was just going to say, I think it's different for everyone. And I think, I love the metaphor of mosaics, that each of us holds a piece of the whole. What is my gift that I can offer up in the name of community? And how can I serve? And I can only answer for me. For me, what feels most heightened and alive at this moment is to reach out to people who think differently than I do. I want to understand where they are, or at least listen, and then figure out where the connective points are. What binds us together? What pulls us apart? As a writer, how can I find bridges to climate and health, to the land? I mean, the land. Why is the protection of land and biological diversity a similar story to diversity at large? How do we make these connections? That's what I'm interested in. And listening more and speaking less.
And there's so many layers to it, and I think people are in such different positions. Some people do all of their work as a kindergarten teacher. Some people do remarkable work. They're a supermarket checker, but somehow they interact with people is transformative. And one thing that I think is always really important to remember is we don't actually need it to get everybody on board. I used to see people get very excited about surveys like what percentage of Americans believe climate change is real, which is ridiculous? What percentage of Americans believe the earth is flat? We don't need everyone on board to get a lot of legislation or other action that we need necessarily. And, some things we do, but there is a way. For example, a lot of people did not support the civil rights demonstrations. Most white people thought the civil rights demonstrations of the mid-1960s were kind of too, they were too edgy for them. And it's like their reaction to Kamala Harris now. They felt threatened and stuff. And if you wait for everybody's approval, you wait forever. So I think there's things, absolutely building solidarity and finding common ground and relationships, breaking down some of the kind of bunkers in which we're so separate from each other, and people see each other in terms of the mythology of the black predator or the redneck or the, or et cetera, are really, it's part of the work. But also I think there's things that we don't have, we have 10 years to make the climate transition, and it needs to move really fast, and it needs to move, I think of my friend Erica Chenoweth's study that shows it takes 3.5% of the population to be engaged in nonviolent direct action to overthrow a regime. And, and usually when that happens, you have the support of a lot more people. But a lot of times, though, people follow action. Action doesn't always follow people. That something happens. You see something like Standing Rock, Occupy Wall Street, and you see that people come around to it. It was really interesting in June watching a lot of moderate white people I know go from being really hostile to the phrase defund the police to actually seeing city councils defunding the police and kind of getting what the phrase meant. And, so it happens in so many different ways. And so I'm not prescriptive. I'm interested. And again, Terry brought up biodiversity. How do we have a kind of biodiversity of relationships and tactics and strategies and campaigns and relationships, and how do we also recognize the biodiversity that each of us has different gifts and locations and networks and capacities, and that, we don't all have to do it the same way. And I think that's one of the ways the left, at its most obnoxious, fails, is when it's like, it starts telling people the way I'm doing it is the way everyone should do it. Being a vegan grad student who doesn't own a car should be a universal human phenomenon. Doesn't fly that well for, rural people with 3 kids and, and maybe some cows and horses. And,
Thank you. I think about that a lot. I grew up in a little red corner of South Jersey and now live in one of the most liberal counties, and talk, as Rebecca, as and to people like myself. And I think about that a lot as I think about my family who are still there. How do we reach across those divides and have those conversations, like Terry said, with family? And I think maybe it starts in some ways there. And in some ways from both of you, what you do is you tell stories, and I think those stories can reach people, even outside of the bubble, this bubble that we all in some ways live in. And so thank you for that. We have a couple of questions about people with children. We have a 21-month-old here, and I think about the future a lot. And a question here from Karen. She says, "My children are in their early 20s. Can you imagine?" I mean, I think about that with a 21-month-old. What strategies or ideas might you have for moms, and I would add dads, to share with them in navigating what looks to me like an extremely negative future? She says, "I think they're stronger than I am and are better fit for facing this than I am." And she says, "I wish I had magic words for them." And maybe it's not magic words that you can offer, but do you have some perspective that you can share for parents and for kids, as looking at this future that we're all very troubled by?
Terry, thoughts?
I think about students again, and I love them so much, and I feel like they are my teachers. And in this total moment, this difficult moment where many of them are back living at home. I had one student who had to read her essay in a closet because she was afraid that her mother would hear what she was saying. This is not an easy time. The loss of touch, the loss of lovers, the loss of, experimentation. It's a really hard time. And I see that in many ways, there's anger there, there's frustration, there's fear, there's uncertainty. They have no future that they can see immediately. But they're creating. What I see in this moment is the students and the young people that I know in their 20s, and I spend a lot of time with that age group, they are pragmatic visionaries. They are creators. They're making things. Today I posted actually on social media, a friend of mine, a student, Lindsay Seawald, she's a rock star, literally a rock star, just pounding the hell out of her drums. It was so fantastic, and I thought, give me some drumsticks. That would be very useful right now. And she did a live concert on Zoom for all of us. It was the first live concert any of us had been in our class. I also think letting go, trusting the students to know what they need. And when they don't, they will ask. I had a friend, Bianca Giever, who called, and she was in Los Angeles. She works for the New York Times. We had been in correspondence with audio letters, and she called and said, "Terry, what do I do? I'm terrified. I can't see. I can't. It's a cigarette burn through the gray, the smoke. I don't know where I am. I woke up this morning and all I could think of was an obituary for the land. Will you write that?" The pre-pandemic me would have said, "I don't know." The pandemic me said, "I will try." And when she said, "I'll call you in an hour," I had it done. I think we show up for our young people in the ways that we can. And the other part, I think, is listening. Again, listening, asking the hard questions that my grandmother asked of me, and then opening the doors where we can and being generous. Also, calling bullshit when it's needed, and taking the resistance away so that they can flourish. I don't know. Rebecca?
There's no one size fits all answer. There are chronically depressed and lonely kids. There are I'm friends. I asked the local chapter of the Sunrise Movement if I could be its aunt, and have been officially accepted as their aunt. And I look at the Sunrise Movement kids who, I'm like, I hope that's not patronizing language. I'm almost 60 and everyone under 40 is a kid. And, but I look at how they got the new Green New Deal across, how they've been hugely influential in this election and so much else, how they've gotten Ed Markey and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to, advocate for them in the House and Senate. And something that comes to mind in response to an earlier question is our friend Bill McKibben was asked, "What can I do as an individual?" over and over and over again. And his answer is always some variation on "stop being an individual." I think the sense of powerlessness about the future is overwhelming. And one of the answers is to find power, which is often congregating with like-minded souls. And also, I think knowing the historical record, which is and finding in it both a history of moments in which ordinary people have exerted extraordinary power to transform the world for the better, but also a reminder that not only is the world getting worse in a lot of ways, but it is getting better in a lot of ways. And just in my lifetime, what feminism, rights for queer and trans people, racial justice, and just the consciousness to recognize those things that people were so oblivious to so often, and really so much of it in the last 5 and 10 and 15 years. And so to see that we live in I think a revolution began in the 60s. It's not about college guys in the Vietnam War so much, but a revolution against authority and hierarchy, a revolution against patriarchy, a revolution against white supremacy and colonialism, and etc. We're in the midst of a long revolution, and there's a lot of incredibly positive and transformative things. And what Terry was saying, there is there are a lot of new understandings also, and you had Melvin Sheldrake in recently, of thinking of a world of systems of deep interconnection rather than the kind of lonely, isolated individualism, and to understand that you're living in the midst of turbulent, dynamic change, and that and that you can participate in it, and that a lot of it I think is really good, is really wonderful. There was a great piece about the election saying that reporting on elections or predicting elections is not like predicting the weather. It was Zeynep, I never have to say her name out loud, Tufekci, the Turkish-born tech and social critic, but she was saying, reporting predictions about elections alter the elections. And there is a way in which also we have to constantly remind ourselves. I have to constantly remind myself, we don't know what's going to happen because we are writing the future by our action and inaction. I think there's a certain amount of climate change that's baked in, but what we do in the next 10 years makes all the difference. So that it's so important to me that people not resign themselves to, and I often see people who are not very sophisticated about climate saying like, game over, we lost, it's inevitable, etc. And then see the best climate scientists around the world say the best and worst case scenarios are so far apart, and the best case scenario is so much better, and it's worth doing this. So all those things I think are so much part of what has kept me hopeful, and I've tried to give people, but of course it's not one size fits all, and it isn't for everyone. So.
Thanks. You mentioned Merlin Sheldrake, whose wonderful book, Entangled Life, has these wild philosophical implications about what it means to be an individual. And the other part of his book that I found kind of staggering as a reminder, and in some ways I think about this a lot as a futurist, how much we don't know. There is so much that we don't know. We have this feeling that we know, as you were just saying, Rebecca, like we don't know what's going to happen. There's so much uncertainty and positive, and we kind of have to live with that trouble and live with that ambiguity, which I find both of what you're saying tonight just really resonates in that way. Maybe sorry, Terry.
I was just going to say, the one thing we really haven't mentioned, and I find it a topic of conversation with my younger friends, as well as colleagues, is grief. I think we have to acknowledge the grief that we're feeling, the grief for this pandemic, the grief that has not been acknowledged with 230 plus thousand fellow citizens dead. And how we do that, I don't know. But I think, what are the rituals? What are the ceremonies? What are, again, the conversations? What are we grieving? That's a conversation that has been very important in my conversations with, in terms of an intergenerational dialogue. Where is our grief located? How do we place and manifest our grief? And I love how Victoria Cheng in her poetry book, Obit, talks about how grief is movement. It's not a steady state, but it's something that we walk with, that we live with, that we're in conversation with. I know I am. Grief for me is the raven on my shoulder. And I think that if we walk with grief, it allows us to find the courage not to look away. And I think that's an important practice.
That's so connected to what I read earlier about people who talk about, like, I'm just going to leave the country. We are often told that life is supposed to be pleasant and easy and comfortable, at least for sort of middle-class white people, and that something's wrong when it isn't. And I think one of the really valuable things that these perspectives from other times and other places, and people, for example, who dedicate their lives as monks, and Buddhist monks and things, is, to people who dedicate to lives of services, that maybe that's not what life is supposed to be. And maybe life is not actually, that's not what, one of the things that so much of my work has brought me to believe is that what we really crave is meaning. We're constantly told that we want life to be easy and pleasant and luxurious and comfortable, because that really moves products. Meaning only moves one kind of product, and happily Stephen's selling it, and Terry and I are producing it. But I think we really want meaning in looking at people who, and that there is no meaning without engaging with grief, pain, suffering, and difficulty. And that often, and just that American question, are you happy? Drives me nuts, because happiness is usually predicated on avoidance of difficulty. And I don't think that avoiding difficulty actually makes you happy, but we're told it does. And that a meaningful life is often difficult, and it might be full of sadness and even grief, but there's also a quality of depth to it that's so antithetical to the kind of flight into the shallowness that I think also social media and marketing and capitalism generally encourages, because that itself is a kind of estrangement from each other, from ourselves, from our political engagement, that makes us bad human beings but good consumers. And that's one of the struggles always, is how do you, and I think this ties back again to what Terry read, how do we constantly do the work to bring ourselves back to being citizens rather than consumers? And citizens not only in the sense of, and no disrespect to people who don't have citizenship, as it gets weirder and harder and more dangerous and politicized in this country, but citizens in a sense of people who live in a place and have a commitment.
And I think that comes to that idea of, then we can embrace change rather than reject change. And I love Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower, when Lauren talks about the Earthseed notebooks, how God is change, change is God. And I thought, what a very different orientation than are you happy? To realize change is the way of the world. Change is the way of the universe, and we are part of that change.
Well, maybe a good question to end on here, as we gather to talk things through and about this anthology. Someone asked, how do you define radical? What is radical to you? Big question to end on, I know.
Terry? I'm curious to see if you'll say some of the things I'm thinking of saying, but
I think about the title of this anthology, with, the most radical act we can commit is to stay home, to be close to the root of things. Utah's not an easy place to live, but it's who I am. And I have never felt more present and alive than I have in these 8 months being home. I know the language here. I know who I live among, and the species. We just had a flock of pinion jays fly through this afternoon, and the way the light struck their wings, they were like starlets, moving through the valley. So to me, the most radical act is being home. I also think a radical act is to be evicted from one's tribe, and that is, and I think to follow one's heart, even if it means there will be consequences, and not being good or nice, but being fierce and gracious at once, if that's possible. I think that's radical. To be open to change, but not to sacrifice your principles. Lily Ye taught me that with The Barefoot Artist.
My brother David always loved the word radical because it actually originates from the idea of roots, radices, as in radish. And so we're back with Melvin Sheldrake and the sort of rhizomatic, myco, how do you say that word? You know, the kind of wonderful fungal networks underground. And it feels like, in a way, what all these debates about, including the election, is, are we networks of interconnection, or are we isolated individuals who owe each other nothing? And disconnection in this country is constantly praised as being free and powerful, particularly for men, and being connected as being somehow trapped, burdened, unfree. The word free, somebody who works at San Quentin as teaching writing pointed out to me years ago, actually the Old English word free means members of a family. The slaves were not free because they were not members of the family. They were outsiders, who were enslaved. And so there's this really interesting debate in this country about what free is. And I think to be radical is to be free, and to be free is to be radical, but that means to be deeply connected and not disconnected and isolated. And that's kind of a conversation we've been having all through the history of this country. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about the new ideas that emerge is that there's so much more systemic, that they don't regard us as isolated individuals. But it is, and I wrote an essay a few years ago called The Ideology of Isolation. I think at the root of a lot of conservative philosophy is that things are not connected to other things. I refuse to acknowledge that my tailpipe emissions are connected to the thickness of the CO2 in the atmosphere, which is connected to the climate. I refuse to believe that poverty is systemic and connected to racism that is also systemic. And so, so radical, I think, can lead us back to the profound connection among all things, which in a way is what Orion Magazine has been about a lot of times, that it was often about nature in the most overt sense. But I think also what all of us who've been called nature writers have been trying to do often, a lot of times through the non-human world, the natural world, but in other ways as well, is to help ourselves and others think systemically and see the radical connectiveness that is meaning and responsibility and power and possibility, and that holds, the forces that hold the the world together. But maybe that was meant to be plural. I should have also said at the beginning of this, yesterday was incredibly exhausting, 12 hours of pole watching, 3 hours of driving, and I'm surprised I'm able to construct sentences. That it's lovely to be here with Terry, whatever the hell I've been doing this last hour plus.
100% coherent. And I want to thank you both for, I know, you're exhausted as we all are, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight and for this. I feel like I've had a profound experience just sitting here in my dining room, which hasn't often been the case, especially as I'm just refreshing, election news. So thank you both, and thanks to everyone at Orion for arranging this, and for everyone who joined us tonight or who will watch the replay later on. We're very grateful and again honored to have you two both back with us. And as I said when Terry joined us a couple of weeks ago, that I can't wait till we can do this in person in Point Reyes Station sometime in the hopefully not too distant future, in a little brighter and better world that we're all going to work on getting toward. So thank you. Please get some sleep.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I just feel like Point Reyes Books is an oasis of consciousness that is neither radical or conservative, but engagement. And Rebecca, I love you. Thank you, Orion, and thank you for everyone that's joined us. This is what keeps us upright.
Love you too, Terry. Thank you, everyone. And remember, we're writing the future now with the election, but so much beyond it is not yet written. And in this, we're all writers.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everybody.